Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we have a very special episode because we are welcoming not one, but two guests on the show. We have Rusty Tagliareni and Lisa Marie Blohm from the Preserve Greystone Project here to talk about what it was like to try and save the old Kirkbride building. So, welcome, special guests. And the crowd goes wild.
Hello.
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 All right. So I figure we could just start by, telling us a little bit about who you both are, maybe what you do for work, and then how you got involved in this whole project of Preserve Greystone.
Lisa,
After
should
you,
go
Rusty.
first. Oh my
Okay,
God.
fine.
Okay.
Fine.
Yeah.
I actually didn't get involved in, Preserve Greystone from the front until the very end, and some might say at that point in time it was almost gone. My background is in television, and then I transferred into the events industry, and that's where I'm at. So really nothing that has anything to do with, buildings or history or anything like that. I live in Parsippany, which is 5 minutes away from Greystone, and, I had always heard about it. My mother's brother was a patient there for a very long time, but one day I rode my bike just kind of in a different direction on a rainy summer day. Well, I didn't know it was gonna rain until after, unfortunately, but I rode my bike up to Greystone, and it was just hulking and giant in front of me, and it didn't seem real. And then a few weeks later, I brought a friend over to that area because we just needed to get out of the house. He was visiting and we were cooped up. And I looked at the sign and it said that the demolition was going to start the next day. And we always had heard, Greystone's coming down, Greystone's coming down. But it kind of seemed like that was a moment to realize that this was an important thing that was, you know, about to disappear.
Yeah, for sure. My goodness. So that was like a moment that you noticed that something was really going to change. I remember, like, we said the same thing with Oregon State Hospital. It had been around for over 100 years, and it finally got to a point where it was like, okay, this is not sustainable, and it too had to come down. So it's hard to see the old buildings go. Really hard to see those old buildings go.
Yeah, definitely.
My background's a little different, but similar in a way. My background's in photography, writing, and video production. I have always had, and my partner, Christina, as well. So when I say we, I'm speaking on behalf of both of us because we very much, for the past 18 years, have done this together. So we've always had there's better words for it, soft spot for historical architecture. And that's always been what we gravitated toward. And eventually over time, we were able to craft that into something substantial and poignant and able to, as we tried over the years, use as preservation tools. We do talks, we write books, we show people our pictures, anything to engage and to be able to share the stories of the buildings with others. Greystone was a place that was on our radar for quite some time. We had seen it before the demo was announced as actually happening. And our first time ever seeing the structure was right at, they call it the blue hour, right before the sun comes over the horizon, before the actual sunrise. And it was enshrouded with fog. And the scale of the building is hard to explain from just speaking, but it's so long and so massive that the wings would just disappear into the haze. You could not see one end from the other end of the building, even though it's on a flat surface. So it really, really lended to the sense of scale. And you felt it was a very significant building, not just based on the space that it occupied, but the fact that it's hard to explain. There's an energy to buildings like that, especially very old ones. And it just radiated from that place. It's an empty field now. It's an empty field. There's a scar in the earth where the building used to be. You can kind of see the foundation if you look at it on Google
Spoiler
Maps.
alert.
Oh,
Just kidding.
cut the part out. But the point is, even though it's gone, if you go visit that site, even I think if you had no idea what used to be there, if you brought an absolute stranger there and you stood there, there's an atmosphere to this land which is hard to articulate. if you haven't experienced it yourself. And it's this awareness of generations, this awareness of history, and it's like tangible and you feel it. And I don't know how to explain it to someone who hasn't experienced it, but it very much feels like it's still there, even though it's gone now. It's a ghost of itself, I suppose. Point is, that type of feeling when you experience things like that, you want to share them with other people, and that's what we set about doing. I think Lisa in her own way and myself in my own way, because it's important, and there's extremely layered histories to these places, and a lot of them are very significant. But I'm sure we'll get into that as this goes on. So
Absolutely. No, I'm glad you shared that. And I think it's important that you mentioned that your background is in photography. That was sort of my gateway into all of this as well, is just the pictures of these old hospitals being, in their abandoned, decaying states. I used to look at them as almost like an ASMR sort of thing where there was something very calming about it to me. And there was something about the stories that I knew they inherently had, and the sort of moments of like, oh, if these walls could talk, the stories they would share. And I became so fascinated with them, and I would just scroll and scroll through all these pictures, and I knew there were so many stories to tell there. And that's sort of what devolved into me doing this podcast. Was I have to know these stories. I have to know what happened there, because there is a story and a history that's kind of larger than life. And I know in regard to Greystone Park specifically, I mean, I think it was in your book that it said that it was at one time the largest single foundation building in the country until the Pentagon was built. So, I mean, that gives you an idea of just the scale of the building itself. My
a
goodness.
bit shy of 700,000 square feet, which is hard to fathom if you don't
Yeah.
actually see that. Yeah.
Yeah, that I'm trying to compare literally anything to that. I'm like, oh, that just doesn't even compute in my
There
brain.
is nothing because we keep tearing them down.
True, truly, truly. They're going up instead of out.
There's a great just kind of to see the scope. There's a great shot that one of our friends, a drone pilot, Jody Johnson, took. Jody and I did a short drone film together on Greystone, but there's this great shot where her drone just kind of goes left to right, and it's when almost all of the building is gone except for the administration building, and you can literally see, like, it's like somebody drew with their finger the outline of the building, and it
Wow.
looks, I mean, it looks like a road almost, but it still had literally the very straight lines and corners of the Kirkbride still, and they were just these big ditches probably when you were close to it, but it really, that was kind of the thing that struck me as how massive this building really was.
Yeah, and what always gets me about the Kirkbrides is for the scale of them. They were huge. The original intent, obviously Greystone was different, but the original intent for most of them was that they would only hold 250 patients, and Greystone was 800 at the beginning, and I'm thinking 800 people in that massive building.
800. I mean, to just a little bit of detail, 800 actually was not the intended. That was what it had to open with. Um,
Okay.
it was the intent, part of the thesis of the Kirkbride plan around which these constructions were erected, was that the directors were to know each patient personally.
Mhm.
And that was the purpose of the tool, which was the hospital. It was
Mhm.
compassionate care. It was so at its peak in 1954, Greystone housed 7,600 plus patients
Yeah.
in a facility that was built for 5 to 800.
Right.
So it was not a tool that was used appropriately, essentially, is what happened.
Mhm. I know Dr. Kirkbride was uh, devastated is probably the best word to see what happened to his hospitals by the end of his life, because he did go into them with such good intentions, and they just quickly devolved almost through no fault of their own, because they couldn't say no to the if somebody was committed by the courts or by a doctor, then that's where they went. And it's hard to imagine not being able to say no. And I think throughout my coverage of Greystone, I really appreciated being able to see the annual reports and just getting the sense of the urgency from the medical directors. This is not the way this hospital is supposed to be. And just feeling that, the sense of helplessness from all of them, that they really wanted better for their patients and they just were doing the best they could with their limited resources, and how terrible it ended up for so many people. So I guess on a happier note, sort of. So once the original Kirkbride closed, that was 2008, right? When it stopped being used for administrative purposes, is my understanding.
Yes, it was systematic. They would empty out the wings as they constructed new housing for the patients, or relocated them elsewhere. They did use the administration up through 2008, and then basically shuttered the building. They would be in and out of it occasionally, just using it basically as a giant storage.
Mm-hmm.
But for all intents and purposes, 2008 was the end of its operation, I would call it.
Okay. And was that the same year that the Preserve Greystone effort began?
It began shortly thereafter. It actually was sparked long before the demolition of the actual building, because the original proposal, when the building was first obviously going to be vacant, was that they were going to level it and build townhouses, and
Mm-hmm.
that no one wanted that. I mean, it's not that townhouses are inappropriate. It's not that townhouses are not needed. Low income housing is also needed, but that's probably the worst place to put it, is over the site of a
Mhm.
beautiful, beautiful old building. You can go literally anywhere else, but
Mm-hmm.
so that's what started the organization. I can't speak to all of the nuance of the birth of the organization, because that's not something I was around for. We
Okay.
came in at the later end.
Okay. And how did you both get started? Did you personally get started in it? What drew you into it?
Lisa, do you want to speak first?
I'll speak first, that's fine. I actually, like I said, I did not really enter the picture until, her fate was pretty close to being sealed. So, I was sort of on the outskirts with some of the people who were very involved for a while, and, towards the very end, I went to the rally, I went to the court case, I went to some New Jersey teachers, Chris Christie protests where some people were talking about Greystone. And I really kind of was sitting back on the sidelines a little bit. What I did was, once I realized it was coming down, I started going there every day after work. It's about 5 minutes from my house. So I would just go and photograph the difference from day to day. And my advocacy was kind of talking to people who would stop, and believe it or not, it's been down for almost 10 years, and people still slow down when they're going past the empty site.
Wow.
But yeah, but back when it was still there, I would talk to people who stopped by, and, you know, did sometimes it was just a bunch of people reminiscing that, "Hey, this building was a big part of town." It was a part of everyone's life, it gave jobs, people lived on the ground, but, my advocacy was basically sort of just talking to people about it, and sometimes they would like it, and sometimes they would be like, "Oh, it was an evil place full of evil,
Mm-hmm.
things that happened to people." And, can you change everybody's mind about why it's important? No, but I'd like to think that, I gave a few people something to think about a little bit. But really, I did not get I was not in the core group of Preserve Greystone until a little bit later when, and I don't know if spoiler alert, but, but when Preserve Greystone sort of the charter was adopted by a new upcoming group called Preservation Works, which Rusty and I are both still involved in today, which is a preservation group related to Kirkbride buildings at whole.
Oh, I definitely want to hear more about that.
It's
Okay.
it's probably a great end cap for this discussion.
Okay. All right. We'll put a table that for now and then come back to it later. Why do you So, Lisa, you talked about some of the people who really had bad things to say about the hospital, and I wonder, and I know that's pretty common for basically any type of
Mhm.
hospital like this, that we know there were terrible things that went on. A lot of people had good intentions, and some people really did had bad intentions. We're going to find that anywhere. Why, in terms of like thinking about saving the hospital, why were people fighting to tear it down? Because you mentioned like
Rusty's smiling.
rallies. So
Hmm. New Jersey's an interesting state. Um,
fair enough.
Okay.
it's Rusty, do you wanna handle this one?
Mm, I can only speak from my own perspective. I'm obviously not gonna tell you why it came down. I can just tell you my speculations on it.
That is
But
fair
they
enough.
are thoughts that are shared by many people. And if you're a stranger to to how New Jersey government works, which is what Lisa was alluding to, there's speculation that many of the larger, especially developmental demolition and development deals are handled behind certain curtains that the general public aren't. Well, how am I going to word this? I don't want to get a lawsuit. So, starting from the beginning, large scale business deals at a state level in New Jersey are often obscured by a lot of red tape and a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of, you have the book, right? You held up
Yeah.
the book at the beginning. Did
Yes.
you see the end chapter where through the Freedom of Information Act, we petitioned the state of New Jersey to release the documents pertaining to the demolition of Greystone?
Yes.
Okay. So we were able to get a lot of pages released regarding the dealings and discussions regarding the demolition of Greystone. And of those pages, 67 solid pages are redacted from top to bottom with just
Wow.
black bars. And that is how New Jersey operates. And it's a visual example. I think
That
that's
is
the
that is
best way to explain it. But if
mhm.
you want to get to the heart of the matter, why was Greystone demolished? It's because people were afraid of it, and there's a stigma attached to it. And we are dealing with mental health issues, and no one wants to deal with mental health issues. It frightens them to have to look inward on things that make them uncomfortable. People don't like to see something that makes them uncomfortable and then reflect, why does it make me uncomfortable? And
Mhm.
that's why Greystone doesn't exist anymore, if
Mhm.
you want to be simple about it.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair answer, and we see that with a lot of these old buildings, not just here in the US, but I've covered hospitals in other parts of the world as well. There were some in Australia that they had similar discussions of, should we tear this down? It's expensive to upkeep. It's decaying. Let's turn it into upscale housing. And, we could restore it in that way. And there's still the stigma attached. And
Mm.
it still reminds people, like you're saying, of what used to be.
So Traverse City, Michigan was a Kirkbride plan mental institution, and that city wanted to tear that down like no one's business. Raymond
Mhm.
Ervini, I'm not going to get into a big story here, was part of a preservation group very similar to Preserve Greystone. They were able to obtain the building at a tax sale. They were able to retain the building. The city wanted to tear that building down for about 10 years. And now it's shown prominently on the Visit Michigan TV spots.
Hmm.
When they're advertising, come see Michigan, come visit Traverse City. There's a flyover of this beautifully restored multi-use facility, which was the Kirkbride that they wanted to tear down. And it's in their advertising for tourism.
Interesting.
And I think that that's a great argument in and of itself.
Mhm.
It's hard for people to come to a planning board and have, it's always so business related, and you need to have people that have imagination in order to visualize and conceptualize these things. So it's important. They're rare, but there are people out there who can do these things. And
Mhm.
the more examples of successful rehabilitation you have, the easier the argument is in the future.
Mhm. Absolutely. Lisa, you talked a lot about, what it was like for you, the going by the building every day after work and talking to people. Rusty, would you mind talking about what your experience was like? Because what I did leave out in my episodes on Greystone Park was the whole multi-year effort to save the hospital and
Oh,
save the
oh,
building. And so I'm wondering what that experience was like for you
it
personally.
was terrible. Living through it was absolutely awful. But it's one of those things that's like I wasn't sleeping. I lost weight over the 2 years, like, 'cause I wasn't
Mm.
sleeping well, I wasn't eating well, but it's one of those things that's, like, absolutely terrible, but I would do it again just because I feel like I'm such a stronger and better person coming out the other side of that, and my worldview has changed so much through that, that it was extremely important in the developing of how I live the rest of my life to be I'm not being hyperbolic. I think my worldview has changed because of that. But there were people around me, such as Lisa, that we supported each other. And there's a phrase that goes, a burden shared is a burden halved. And it's very true, where if you have someone else to go through it with you, you kind of hold each other up and you have shoulders to lean on. And that was incredibly important during that. We also were approached by Arcadia during that to write that book while the building was still being torn down. And that, I think, just from a psychological level, at least helped me or helped us, Christine and I, keep our sanity because we were able to put this out into some type of tangible creation that other people could read through.
Mhm.
And I remember when we were speaking with Arcadia, I was talking to my editor at the demo site, and typically the Images of America books, they like to keep around 10% of it modern history, meaning within the past 30 years, and the rest of it to be very much historical based. But I was at the site and like the buildings being ground up in the background, and I was expressing the fact that there is too much to tell right now regarding the preservation effort and the demolition. It will not fit in those pages. They allowed us over a quarter of the book to be about the preservation effort and the modern history and the future of the property.
Yeah, and I'm just picked up the book here so I could remind myself. I mean, you have chapter 3 is the downward spiral
Mhm.
as it's going kind of nearing the end of its time, like time as a working hospital.
Yeah, that whole era was why there became a stigma attached to the building. The overpopulation, the understaffing, the abuse, all.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And plenty of reasons for criticism, fair reasons for criticism.
Yeah,
And
they're
then
important conversations to have. I actually enjoy the conversations where people say that is a terrible building, we should be rid of it because I want to engage with those people. And it's also, I don't want to surround myself with people who just agree with everything I think because nothing good comes out of an echo chamber like that anyway. You have to have varying perspectives on things if you want any type of progress to happen.
absolutely. That's true across the board. And then you title chapter 4 Greystone's Last Stand, and that's the whole documenting the efforts to preserve the building and all the rallies like Lisa was talking about. And there's one where there's like a flag draped over the building that seemed political in nature. I'll just leave it
Mhm.
at that. And there's a nice image that you referenced earlier, Rusty, of the redacted materials that you
Yeah.
received. So if anyone wants to reference that, you can pick up a copy of the book for sure.
So yeah, politics was heavy into the demolition of Greystone. Everyone at least had the opinion that it was. Obviously, no one can say for sure because all the pages are redacted anyway, right? So who's to say?
Mhm.
That said, just an interesting note about that banner, which says "Smash the State, not Greystone." It was draped over the building on the first day that they were demolishing it. Someone broke in, went on the roof, tied it off. This big banner. An image of that banner ended up in the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. They had an exhibit on
Mm.
Kirkbride buildings, and that banner, an image of that banner on Greystone, was hanging for months in that
Wow.
National Building Museum. So it resonated with people well outside of the local vicinity.
Absolutely. Do you have any idea how long it stayed there, or did it come down pretty quickly, I
Oh, it
imagine?
came down quickly, but
Mhm.
not before the press could get pictures of it too. So
Well, that's what matters is that documentation. So I guess sort of to counter all of that, we talked about why are people wanting to tear it down? Why do you think it's so important to save buildings like this? And I guess that's sort of a segue into preservation works because I know I have my reasons why I think these buildings should stay, but I'm curious from your perspectives what you think.
I mean, they were important historically. They are important architecturally, and they 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 were more than just a building. I mean, it was kind of this little microcosm, almost like its own little town. I mean, people, they farmed, they built things there. There was a big kitchen, there was a fire department, there were all sorts of little different groups, and that makes this almost like its own little town. And would you wipe out, I know the people are gone or whatever, but wiping that out, it just seems wrong. And something just from the perspective of ooh, my earbud just fell out. Something from the perspective of just what makes more sense, a building, I think it's become a meme at this point, but a building is only, a building is the greenest building is basically the building you already have that you restore. So all those things together, people lived and died there, and some of them, you know, just kind of disappeared because they were already the people left behind.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's why I try to include as many stories as I can, because these people were erased sometimes from their own family. Last week's episode was on Woody Guthrie, and even the doctors encouraged his wife to just say, "Oh, he died." Don't let the kids know that he's this ill and is living in a hospital. And how much they would have lost if they had chosen to do that. I mean, they would have lost the whole rest of his life. And I wonder how many people were told that their family member had died when they actually maybe were shipped off to Greystone or somewhere else.
Mhm. Yeah, Woody Guthrie is a prevalent, obviously, name attached to Greystone. That's fun note. North Star Demolition, even though they tore down the building, were very sympathetic to the history of the building. And it just seems like a perfect time to mention this. They actually halted demolition on the end wing to allow the removal of Woody Guthrie's ward door and Ward 40, the entry door to his ward, as well as the preservation of some of the murals from the hallways, which I then safe housed with my partner for some months until representatives in a moving truck from the Woody Guthrie Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma came, and they took these items, and they're now on display at the Woody Guthrie Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You can
Oh,
go
how
see
good.
the doors from Greystone, things like that. But that all exists today because North Star Demolition actually halted demolition on the building to allow these items to be removed. And I mean, even though people want to scapegoat the demolition company, they're doing their jobs. They're
Mhm.
hired to do. And I know, there's arguments to be said. I'm not getting into them. There's a lot of gray area here, but they were empathetic people and they sympathized
Mm.
and they knew the value of it, of what they were tearing down. And they did everything they could to retain as many. They're like, if there's things, let us know. We will get them out. The building's coming down, but these things don't need to go down with it. And I mean, they're owed a debt of gratitude in a way,
Yeah,
a lot of what they did. Um,
it's very generous.
yeah, so I think they were fantastic at the time, at least. But yeah, touching on that, touching what Lisa said too, what is the history of a building, right? It's not, it opened in 1876. It was demolished in 2015. It had this many people for this many years. It's basically the history of a building is just like countless individual stories of each person that experienced the building or
Mhm.
resided in the building or as a patient or who grew up on the property because their father worked at the building or anything like that. That's the history of a building. You can't articulate it because it's impossible to tell all those stories because you don't know them.
Mhm.
So
People always say, "Well, will you get to this hospital or that hospital?" And I say, I would love to. There are so many of these places, and there are so many stories. I could be doing this till the end of time and probably not get through everybody's stories,
Mhm.
just the ones that are documented, because there's so much life. And, like you mentioned, one of the things that I think about is that this, for many, many people, and at one point for thousands of people, this was home. This was where they spent the majority of their life. This is where they formed relationships. This is where they maybe some experience a certain level of healing. And some, as Lisa mentioned, ended up dying there. And so for a lot of people, this is just it's a sacred place in that sense. And I think for me, when I think of these old buildings, that is a sacred thing to hold on to. And the stories that were so easily erased are the ones that deserve to be told. And I feel myself even choking up just thinking about it, because there's so many stories, and I know that I will only be able to talk about a fraction of them, and that's the tragedy in doing what I do.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's exactly what you said. There's a lot of really painful history in places like Greystone, but those are the histories that people most easily forget because they don't want to muse upon them. They want to forget them. They cause pain. Why do I want to think about this? But I think most of human history, probably the most significant things are the painful things that we have to reflect on, not the happy things. And because, the tragedies and the great losses are what actually shape us. And, you erase those, you do a disservice to everyone that suffered and died there anyway, because now they don't exist at all, right? In a
Right.
generation or two from now, no one's going to remember any of this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Having to,
I sit here now, I saw it and I touched it myself. No one, no one's going to say that in 80 years.
mm-hmm. Right. And I think that's why it's so important that you document these things. I think that's why it's important that you wrote that book, and that there's some attempt to preserve some of the legacy. And that's just really notable. Before we get back to preservation works, what do you hope people remember about Greystone Park specifically and the legacy that it specifically leaves?
Lisa, I talk too much.
That's okay. So I think just remembering that people lived there, and people like not just resided there. I mean, they actually lived there. Some not so well, some well, but you know, it's all sort of a part of, not to sound like hippy dippy, but it's its own little sort of world. And erasing it because there were bad things that happened there. There were good things that happened there too. I used to run into a woman who lived on the grounds. Her father, I think, worked the grounds, and they lived on the grounds. And every time I'd run into her, she'd tell me a different story or point at
Mm.
a tree or whatever. And kind of like what Rusty said, without any sort of memory of the building being there, or better yet, the building, those people and those lives, and both the significant events in their lives and maybe the less significant, it's kind of like they just didn't happen. And I don't know, that's sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a generational attachment to be able to walk past a building and say, my great grandfather looked at this same, these same windows, these same walls that I'm
Mhm.
walking past, and I'm going to bring my kid past, right? There's that connection to generations, like a literal physical conduit connection to generations that is lost when you tear down an old building. It doesn't, not just Greystone, anywhere, right?
Mhm.
As far as Greystone is concerned, though, I think it's a wonderful example. It's a sad, a tragic example of something that was built for the betterment of society. It was built to keep those who could not care for themselves off the streets, out of warehouses, and out of prisons. And we look at the mental health system now, then the prisons are loaded with mental health issues. The streets are loaded with mental health issues. They're in hospitals. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. They're scattered to the wind because these places are gone. And it's like, well, people go, I wish we could do something about it. We can. We have the capability to do it. We've done it in the past. We are willfully not doing it because we have shown through history that we're capable of caring. And we just choose not to care now. And I think that's like heart wrenching when you reflect on it, because these places were built as resorts. They were beautiful. Like, most beautifully appointed buildings that governments ever built were for people who were homeless.
Mm-hmm.
What does that
Mm.
say?
Mm-hmm.
It's so inside of us, as a society, as a country, as an individual, we have the ability to do this. And it would be beautiful if we could do it again one day with the knowledge of the modern times. But the compassion's there. We just choose not to engage it. And it's hard for a lot of people to see that.
I agree. And obviously, as somebody working in the mental health system, that's something that I could talk about for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Um, and I definitely feel that there needs to be more intermediate facilities. And like you said, at one time, we had a plan in place to build and fund those intermediate facilities. And that was taken away. I'll just leave that kind of vague. Um, and that's where we saw the uptick of a lot of unfortunate realities. We saw a lot of a huge increase in incarceration and homelessness. And not to say that, and that's, like I said, it's not to say that mental illness causes violence. It does not. But there is that stigma that it does. And I feel myself devolving a little bit here, but it's all that to say that it's really important that we do have those facilities, and it is possible to bring them back, and I hope that we do. So I'll keep it short, and that's something that I think everybody can take part in. It's something that we need to be writing to our representatives about. It's something that we need to be advocating for, because I think we always say mental health. We need more help with mental health, but that's so vague. If we say specifically, this is what we need, that's where action can actually be taken.
Absolutely.
Again, I could talk about that all day, so I'll try not to devolve any further.
I hit a nerve. That's good, though. That means we're having a good conversation, right?
So just sort of to steer the ship a little back to what we were talking about earlier in regard to preservation works and what you're doing now that obviously, as we mentioned, Greystone Park is no longer there. The building is no longer there. And although the hospital still does exist, I talked in one of the episodes about how there's a pre-doctoral internship that I remember looking at during my training. And I was like, oh, New Jersey, too far. And so I kept concentrated more on the West Coast. But anyway, I'm curious what's going on with other efforts to save other places and what preservation works is like in general.
So, preservation works basically when Greystone was pretty much all hope was basically lost, the Preserve Greystone folks basically handed over the charter to a group called Preservation Works. Rusty was an original member. I was not. Um, the founder was a gentleman named or is a gentleman named Christian Van Antwerpen, and basically out of the dust of Greystone, they wanted to make sure that nothing like that ever happened again. So it's really kind of, you know, education and supporting grassroots efforts that are local, because a lot of these different buildings are tied up with a lot of local, stuff going back and forth between the town and the people. People have a lot of strong feelings about, their local buildings and whatever. So we really try to partner with those groups. We try to educate people on what Kirkbrides are and why they're important. And the group's been around since, I guess, 2015.
Yeah. Do you want me to add anything to that, Lisa? Or?
Feel free.
No, I mean, you are literally the president of the organization. I feel like, well, I'll say my bit. The foundation of Preservation Works came about through the demolition of Greystone. That's literal fact, because we inherited the nonprofit because there was no more Greystone to preserve. It was gone. But there was so much passion in that fight that it seemed a complete waste to just cast it away. So what Christian Van Antwerpen did was went about inheriting the 501c status and forming a group that we all wished existed during our
Mhm.
independent grassroots fights. Because when you're fighting City Hall, you're fighting the state, you're just a bunch of angry people screaming at the sky is what it seems like. But what we operate as at Preservation Works is an advocacy group. We platform these people, and if they have weak points in their organization that they need more information regarding, maybe development people, maybe people who are architecturally inclined, who can tell you about the design and the overall format of the property that you're looking at. We have people in our group who lend their expertise to these small grassroots groups to empower them in their local fights. Does that make sense? There was a lot of words.
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay. So we're the group that we wish existed when we were fighting for Greystone, is what we try to do. And in that way, at least for me personally, it helps me carry along the legacy of Greystone, because I feel like Greystone still exists in these buildings that it helps save.
What buildings are you working on currently?
I don't know if we should talk too much about certain ones. Lisa, I'm leaving that up to you.
That's fair.
Um, yeah, let's put a let's put a
Here's a better question.
With
If folks
politics.
want to learn more about Preservation Works, where can they find information on Preservation Works?
our website, which is www.thepreservationworks.org. You can also we have a Facebook, which is facebook.com/preservationworks, and I think our Instagram is Kirkbride Preservation Works. And you can follow and see what we're doing. You know, we love kind of interacting with not only people who, who are involved in local groups to, sometimes not even just save a particular Kirkbride building, but save their local history because, hey, those are the groups that can kind of come together when their local building, is in danger. We also like, we interact a lot with, you know, different organizations, different, you know, the I don't think you've done a show on have you done a show on Buffalo yet?
Not yet. It's on the list. The list is long.
I know, especially because you go through all the stories and everything,
Yeah.
but yeah, so, we do, like, a fundraiser every year that helps us support different efforts, and, the last couple years, we've done a tour of the outer wings of the Buffalo State Hospital. For your listeners maybe who don't know, Buffalo State Hospital was abandoned and kind of falling apart, disused, and they turned the center building into a hotel. The outer wings remained vacant, but they're made safe and they're basically like frozen in time. So the Richardson Olmsted company, which basically runs the campus, they're a 501c3 as well. We do a fundraiser where we go up there and we engage with photographers and urban explorers or people who are maybe just starting out in urban exploration. So we have a constituency that's a lot of different kind of groups, preservation leagues, urban explorers, the age range of the people who are interested in what we do is phenomenal.
Very cool. So Buffalo was one that a previous one that you worked on.
They were actually working to restore it at the same time Greystone was coming down. So it was
Okay.
you know, kind of a parallel backwards situation.
We cited them a lot during the demolition of Greystone because the cost to rehabilitate their facility was the same as the cost to demolish Greystone. Um,
Hmm.
very, very similar numbers. So you're looking at two utterly different results. New Jersey has an empty field, and Buffalo has a
Hub.
fantastic, like it is a, you have to see it. And I mean, yeah, pictures do it justice, but it's one of those buildings that if you go visit it in person, you are just flabbergasted that this type of architecture exists in the United States
Hmm.
and not in like a
Truly is
story.
a castle.
Yeah, it's phenomenal.
As I recall, that's a particularly large hospital.
Yeah. And
Another
even,
one that's tall, right?
Very tall, big spires.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And even the land that it's on, like the actual land that it's on is kind of becoming, it's kind of like going back in time because it's becoming sort of a hub in the town.
Hmm.
Back when these buildings were active, people worked there, people made deliveries there, people, went to see people there, and we're coming in and out. And now that it's a hotel, the actual grounds, they do a fall fest, they do a winter fest. They have concerts and ice skating, and they were in the path of totality for the eclipse.
Oh,
So,
cool.
yeah, so they literally have 2 photos if you look at their Instagram, where one is right before the eclipse and it looks like daytime and the camera's in the exact same setup, and one's during totality and it looks like nighttime. It's really cool to look at, but it's just become kind of a hub for Buffalo. And, it was kind of like that when it was in existence. So it's kind of neat to see it go full circle like that.
Absolutely. And so it's amazing that by preserving the building, you almost give it a new life, like a regeneration, really. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. And so, Lisa, you mentioned where we could find the information for preservation works, where people can find you on the different platforms. Do either of you have uh, social media or anything that you would like to share, or other places where people can find your work? I know, Rusty, you have the book, the Images of America book, Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital, and that's available at Amazon, wherever people buy their books.
Yeah. I don't have a book. I have and maybe I'll link it on your page, but I mentioned a friend of ours, Jody Johnson, that Glide by JJ, that shot this beautiful drone video that I edited for her, and Christina and Rusty provided some clips of some sound bites that we ended up using, and maybe I'll link that short film in in your post about this episode or something. But
That would be great.
um I don't have a book.
That's all right. Neither do I.
You have a
Rusty's the only
podcast.
one among us.
Yeah, they're terrible. Don't write books. But no, I don't have anything to plug. I want this to focus on Greystone. We did do some work during the preservation effort. We made a series of vignettes called Greystone's Last Stand, which is what the last chapter of the book is based on. If you want a really, well, not a really, but a moderately deep dive into some of the feelings about the demolition when it was ongoing and the repercussions of it coming down, you can just Google or YouTube Greystone's Last Stand and it will come up. We interviewed a lot of people that were involved in the process and while the process was underway. So it's 10 years old at this point, but it itself is like a time capsule because you can see in real time how things were going. So
Nice. Well, thank you both so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about what the effort was like to save Greystone Park, even though, it's like you said, it's no longer there, but we still have lots of memories and it leaves a legacy for sure. All right. And thank you all for listening. As always, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening, but especially on Apple Podcasts. That helps others find and listen to the show. And of course, remember the words of Maya Angelou: do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.